Hi class, in this recording we're going to be talking about directional terminology, regional terminology, cavities, and organ systems within the human body. So as we look at our human body, we need a standardized frame of reference. And this standardized frame of reference is called the anatomic position or anatomical position. So as we're looking at this frame of reference, this is the assumption. Whenever you're asked a directional term or question, always assume this reference point. Note how the individual here, this person is standing up. We have the head erect. We have arms and legs straight and pointing down. We have palms forward. We have thumbs pointing outward. And yes, I know I'm not using directional terminology yet. I haven't introduced it yet. I'll do that in a couple slides. So this is our standard anatomic position. And once we have this reference point of our standard anatomical position, we can start to introduce directional terminology, such as anterior and posterior. And students, while you're studying this, you need to focus on pairing them opposites in your mind. So when we think of anterior, anterior is towards the front, posterior is towards the back. Superior, inferior, this applies towards the head and trunk. And as we're looking at this terminology, superior means towards the head or up, and then inferior means downward or towards the bottom. And this is for head and trunk only. As we look at medial and lateral, first I need to emphasize medial. Median and medial are not the same thing. Medial is a directional terminology that means towards the midline of the body, right down the middle of the trunk. Median is a term that refers to the midline of that particular structure or appendage or region of the body. So if it's medial, it's towards the midline of the body. If it's lateral, it's away from the midline of the body. Now, if we go back to that directional terminology, or excuse me, standard anatomical position, let me back up a slide here for us. So as you look at that standard anatomical position, we assume the arms and legs are going to be pointing down or inferiorly. But the reality of the situation is that a lot of times when you're working with an individual, the arms and legs or appendages are going to have variable orientations. And these variable orientations mean that we need to have a slightly different term for that, for the directional points. So we use proximal and distal for appendages, think arms or legs, or we can even have smaller structures in the body, like your fingers are a smaller appendage off your hand, or your appendix is a small appendage off of the cecum of the large intestine. And when we look at proximal, proximal means towards the attachment point. When we look at distal, distal means away from the attachment point. And we use proximal and distal for appendages regardless of orientation of those appendages. And we also have superficial and deep. When we look at superficial, superficial means towards the surface of the body. Think of your skin is superficial. When we think of deep, we think away from the surface of the body, away from the surface. So, for example, your heart is superficial relative to the skin because your heart is farther away from the surface of your body compared to the skin. I could say that my elbow is distal relative to my hand because my elbow is closer to where my arm attaches to my body compared to my hand. So make sure you practice this directional terminology and are comfortable with it. To help reinforce this, we have this figure that I've included. We have proximal, distal, medial, lateral, and all of the directional terminology I covered on the previous slide shown. One notable thing on this figure, though, is we are no longer going to be using ventral and dorsal. I am trying my hardest to phase those terms out. Ventral and dorsal are hold-offs from when we had quadruped directional terminology. And initially, there was a lot more overlap between human anatomy and physiology and regular study of animal form and function. But we as humans are bipeds. We stand on 2 feet, and we don't stand on 4 feet. So using ventral and dorsal, which is quadruped terminology, is not very appropriate for human beings. As we look at the human body, we can also take the human body and slice it differently and have different directional slices to give us different planes or views of the human body. So as we look at this purple view right here in purple, that purple plane is known as a frontal plane, also known as a coronal plane. The coronal or frontal planes will give you an anterior-posterior piece, or slight chunks when you're left over. When we look at a transverse plane, transverse is shown in orange right here, and this transverse plane is going to give you superior inferior pieces to the human body, or top-bottom chunks. When we look at sagittal, a sagittal plane is any slice that gives you left-right pieces, and there's a subcategory that I've indented underneath, a mid-sagittal plane, aka a median plane. That's going to be shown here in teal, at that teal line. That gives you equal left-right pieces. They don't have to be exactly equal down to the micron, but relatively close, within a millimeter or two, equal pieces as we look at those left and right chunks. Of the planes that we look at the body, very rarely do I see sagittal planes included in the textbook. It happens every once in a while. Overwhelmingly, though, mid-sagittal planes are going to be used over sagittal slices. As we look at these sections, here's some examples for you. We have a mid-sagittal slice through a female abdominal pelvic cavity. Here we have a frontal slice through heart and lungs. This is also known as a coronal slice. This mid-sagittal slice, and this should really say mid-sagittal slice because it's exactly down the middle, or median slice of that abdominal pelvic cavity shows the reproductive and digestive organs of the female pelvis. And here we have a transverse slice through the human skull. So depending on the slice, you get different views of the same structures. That's all we have for this recording. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them in the class discussion board. Shoot me an email, and as always, happy studies.